Today we're going to be looking at the actual differences between lengths of tonearm, and it's not what you might expect. Hello, welcome to this Tonearm Design Deep Dive. This is episode 3. I'm David Baker of Origin Live. This is our company founder and also my father, Mark. And today we're looking at tonearm length. Now, everybody thinks that the longer your tonearm is, the more linear it is, the more it will track in a more straight line if it's a longer arm. But to us, it seems like the bigger difference is actually inertia.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the difference in tracking error, which is what we're talking about here, this is not a simple subject, by the way, so I'm going to try and dumb it down a little bit. But there are several differences that you get between a long arm and a short arm. Sonically, let's just talk sonically for a start. The subjective difference is that a short arm will tend to make the music sound a bit faster, you'll get a little bit more detail in it, and a longer arm will sound more relaxing to listen to, smoother,
Yep.
There'll be more bass weight there, and it's just an easier ride. It's like, there are swings and roundabouts with them both. Personally, and most people I think tend to come down on the side of the fact that the longer arm sounds better. But I would suggest that it's not all about the fact that it's got less tracking error. It's down to other factors, because there are other differences, physical differences between these two. The biggest one being the effective mass, and the other one being that the side force, the applied side force that you need to apply to a longer arm is less than for a shorter arm. And that's quite a big one, which is never talked about.
So you talked there about the shorter arm has the ability to be a little bit more punchy, a little bit faster, maybe more attack, and maybe better in
more
a little
edgy,
bit
more
better,
edgy as well.
A little bit more edgy, yeah.
Yeah.
And the longer arm is a little bit more, you could say controlled, or you could say smoother. Now, we think that that is to do with inertia. So what is inertia?
It's to do with all three factors. Inertia is probably the biggest one, though. And I mean, who can really say for sure? Because it's almost impossible to quantify what is contributing what. Like the tracking error difference between these two arms is 0.5%. That's the actual tracking error.
And that's
difference.
only in the kind of outer reaches, the inner tracks. The difference is 0.5.
Yeah.
So maybe let's go straight into the tracking error. So because we think that the difference between 9.5 and 12 inch, the tracking error might actually have the least to do with it. So what we know is we've got our record.
Well, that's the difference in tracking error. I mean, it's not the total tracking error, that's the difference in tracking error between the two.
So we've got our record, and what we know is when a master is being cut on a record lathe, basically the cutter head moves like this in a straight line right across the record, cutting the groove. And then when we have our tone arm, which is pivoted, this actually moves in an arc. So say we've got our tone arm pivot here, this kind of arcs, it'll be more over there, yeah. So say that's a 9.5 inch pivot. It has an arc, and this is a very exaggerated arc, but it is an arc nonetheless. So it's never tracking perfectly in a perfectly straight line. Now, if you have a 12-inch arm...
Well, there are 2 points here called null points, at which point the cartridge is actually dead in line
with where the
dead
cutter head
perpendicular
would
to
be.
the track itself. Because the advantage of this is that the cutting head is always perpendicular to the track. The tangent there is a right angle at whatever point it's passing. Whereas for a pivoted arm, you can't do that. The tracking head does this, moves in a parallel, like a parallel arm does, parallel tracking arm, I should say. Pivoted arms are different because there's only 2 points where it'll actually be correct. And by the way, this will start about there because that's your overhang measurement
course.
there.
Yep.
All
Yep.
right.
So when we have our 12-inch arm, we go a little bit further back, and because it's longer, the arc is also slightly more flat. It's still an arc, but it's a little bit more flat. So on our 12-inch, maybe we're arcing a little bit more like this.
Yeah.
For most of this arc, it's almost the same. But in this last section where the forces are the greatest and distortion is the greatest, what we actually know is that on between a 9.5 inch and a 12-inch arm, there's only around a 0.5% difference in total harmonic distortion between those two. So if this is our 9.5 inch, excuse my awful handwriting, and this is our 12-inch, the difference between the two is only 0.5% total harmonic difference. So in most of this section of the record, these two arms actually sound quite different. And why is that?
Why is that? Yeah, okay. Probably it's inertia, and we need to talk about inertia because everybody says, oh, you need a low inertia on the tone arm. And inertia is both a friend and an enemy, and it's more of a friend than an enemy.
Okay.
And the reasons I think are worth explaining. I mean, just to start at the very most basic level, what is inertia? It's the resistance to change of motion. So if something's stationary, it's the resistance to getting it moving. And if you've got, say, a ton weight on a frictionless ice surface, all right, that's about the weight of a Mercedes, an old Mercedes, it's going to be a lot harder to get that going than, you know, something like a pen, which you can just flick, all right, so it'll move quickly. And when applying this now to the stylus in the groove, if you had an arm which had absolutely no inertia whatsoever, all right, so imagine this arm has no inertia whatsoever, and it's going through the groove. So the groove wants to move the cantilever of you've got a little stylus on the end starting here, okay? So the stylus, kind of enlarging a little bit with its tip on this is looking at it in plan view, moves like this, and you've got a motor generator mechanism on the end here which generates a signal. That varies depending on the type of cartridge. I'm not going to go there at the moment because it's a whole different subject. All we need to know is that cantilever has to move freely backwards and forwards to create a signal. So it's being forced one way or another. Now, if there is zero inertia, then even if you've got a totally stiff arm, friction-free arm, and all the rest, if there's no inertia, the arm will simply move. Okay, because inertia is weight, but just imagine a massless arm.
Yeah, so there's no
mass anywhere in the
resistance
system
to movement.
Yeah,
it would just go.
Yeah, the arm would simply move with the groove, and the whole thing would just move backwards and forwards, and the cantilever, which is supposed to be held steady at a root point here, so it can move backwards and forwards. The whole arm would just move backwards and forwards instead, and you would have zero signal generation. So as a rule, the more inertia you have, the better your frequency response is going to be, in theory.
Yeah.
It's going to be more dynamic. In particular, what I notice about high inertia arms is that the bass performance is generally a lot better as well. So that's why inertia is your friend. Now, why it's your enemy is that it's all very well saying, you know, this point has to move, but we're dealing with a pivoting system, and the whole arm has to be hinged effectively to move. So you can't just hold it rigid. I mean, life would be so easy if you could, but you can't. So the whole thing is free to move, and all you're relying on here is inertia, because you can't hold it stiffly. So the inertia is very important. Now, when we're talking about inertia, in a straight line inertia is like I've been talking about, pushing your your ton weight along a block of ice. That's linear inertia, but there's something else which is called rotational inertia in physics, and that is totally different, and it's wildly different, because basically the way it works is that the formula is inertia equals mass times radius squared, right? So the radius here is your 9 inches in this case, 12 inches in the other. But just to give you an idea of how this works, if you've got, say, a 1 inch arm, you'd have an awful lot of tracking error.
Floating here.
You would have a lot of tracking error on a 1 inch arm, but call that the R squared is 1. On a 2 inch arm, it goes up to 4 because it's squared, okay? It's 2 squared. Okay, so on a 3 inch arm, it goes up to 9. So what we're saying is that the difference between a 1 inch arm and a 3 inch arm, the inertia is 9 times greater. So it's not just the mass you're thinking about, it's the inertia. And that's very important. So 16, 5 inch, 25 times. So a 5 inch arm has 25 times more inertia than a 1 inch arm. The difference in inertia between a 9.5 and a 12 inch, even if you had no difference in the mass of the arm, okay, that's really important. There's no difference to the mass.
So this is just the cartridge is at a different, it's further away.
The resistance to movement is, I'm not going to do the calculation here, but it works out 67% higher.
Wow.
That's the increase in inertia, even though there's no increase in weight.
Yeah.
And almost inevitably, what we do find with the 12-inch arm is that they do actually have a higher mass as well on top of that.
Yeah.
So it's not only that the inertia, it's not only that the inertia increases, but the inertia also increases because of the increased mass. Now we get on to a very, very thorny subject, which I always don't want to go really, because it gets so controversial. But there are formulas because it's called the effective mass of an arm, and that dictates the inertia really, along with the length. So you've got those two things. But most cartridges have a certain thing called a compliance, which is their springiness. And people say, oh, you must match a high compliance cartridge with a low mass arm. And equally, if you've got a high compliance cartridge, you should match it with a high mass arm. Now, I was talking to a friend of mine, John Burns, who's the Dynavector distributor in the UK, and I've also talked with the Lyra designers when we shared a show with them about this. And they both agree that compliance nowadays with modern cartridges and normal Tonearms is not an issue. It is a non-issue. Now, I hesitate to say that because the people who, are latched onto theory will
swear by it,
will say, no, that's all wrong, But I'd like to make just a few comments on this, and that is that this sprung up, this whole kind of, I wouldn't call it mythology because it's got a certain amount of truth in it, but it sprung up going way back when people were chasing very high compliant cartridges, which means that high compliance means it's very flexible. Okay, very flexible, like you'd call a compliant person a flexible person. All right. Okay. And a low compliance person, a low compliance is something that's very rigid. You don't refer to low compliance people, but you call them rigid
Maybe
people.
we should. Maybe we will now.
But so anyway, people were chasing. They were worried about record wear, and goodness me, there are enough cartridges tracking at 4 grams in those days, whereas now they mostly track at 2 grams. But they were chasing very low friction, low wear on records. So they worked out that, yeah, if you're going to get low wear, you must have low tracking force, which means you need high compliance cartridges. Just as a kind of rule, by the way, that as a rule, the more weight you have on your tracking force, the easier it tends to sit in the groove. And going light on tracking force, thinking, oh, I'm going to save on record wear, is a complete fallacy, because the needle tends to chatter uncontrollably in the groove. So you get more record wear.
It's freer to move.
Yeah, you get more record wear actually if you do that. But it depends on the design of the cartridge. So going back to these very high compliance cartridges, you then needed a low mass arm, and they tended sometimes to track at quite low tracking forces as well. So all of this set up a kind of ideal scenario to get record resonance on records, and so they started to worry about it and come up with formulas. In practice, what we find now is that our arms basically track all cartridges. We don't get mistracking. There's never an issue. There is what I'd describe as an ideal tracking force or inertia for some cartridges. Like a classic is the London Decca cartridge, which tended to sound at its best with a 25 gram effective mass. And so we would add, you can get head shell weights to add to the...
well, that's a very unique kind of coil setup on the Decca anyway, isn't it? It's quite different to your...
It is, but believe me,
average.
There is an ideal effective mass for almost all cartridges. All I can say is that I personally do not fret about it, because it's a very small difference. You can get it, yes, you can get an improvement by getting the effective mass just spot on, but it's so small that it's just not worth worrying about.
Hi, I'm quickly interrupting this video just to ask that if you're finding it worthwhile, please could you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and also press the bell notification. It really helps us to carry on making these videos. And what we want to do is carry on having open conversations about vinyl replay, and also giving you insights into how we've been making turntables and tone arms in-house in the UK since 1986. Well, not me personally, because I'm 31, and that's... Anyway, you get the idea. So thanks, and back to the video.
Yeah, and that tracks with something else I was watching recently from Wally Tools, actually, which is a great channel, from JR Boysclair. So in this video I was watching, Boysclair is basically saying 12 hertz upper limit, but it kind of used to be like an 8 hertz lower limit for tube resonance, but actually going below that isn't such a awful idea now, because previously we avoided going below 8 hertz because of record warps, right, and because of vertical inertia. But his suggestion is basically buy a record flattener.
Yeah, they're quite expensive.
They kind of are, yeah. But is that...
they start about £1,000 now, though. There's some German ones on the market for around that.
Yeah. And even with... So say we don't have a record flattener, what's the problem with vertical inertia there?
Okay. Well, we just draw... If you got a record with a warp in it, we're going to just show that as a bump. And you've got your stylus, which will be sitting about here before it hits the bump. Okay, so that's your stylus. I'm just going to... And this is our arm here.
It's a very interesting tracking angle.
And the whole arm kind of pivots like up and down like so. Okay, so when this bump comes along, it's going to go whee up in the air. And if it's got very high inertia, it's going to carry on going.
It's going to do a jump. It's going to get air.
Yeah, it's going to jump. And
Yeah.
the more the heavier it is, it's got inertia behind it, so it's not going to come down very quickly. Well, I think that's why people think that low inertia is a good idea. I would just like to say a few things about low inertia, because when I started off in this game about 40 years ago, it was one of the first things that I discovered was that one of the things that people like to say is, if this is the yoke of the Tonearm, right? There's your tube, and you've got your rear stub here. And people like to say we should get the counterweight as near to the fulcrum as possible. This is our fulcrum here, obviously, because everything rotates about that. So obviously, the counterweight in that position rather than this position is going to have a much lower inertia.
Right.
All right. They say designers peak at 70, and the Formula One designer has peaked at 70, because there is so much to learn in this game, and I'm still learning. But this is one of the first things I discovered about 40 years back, and that is that we experimented. We started modifying the Riga arm, and one of the first mods we did was a mechanical mod, which made far more difference than rewiring and all the rest, because it's so important, the mechanical side of it. And the Riga stub has a screw connection just about here. So basically, you got your end of the arm tube, and it's got a threaded connection here, and the stub threads into that threaded connection. So you got a stub here. All right. And then the counterweight sits on this.
So this is for tube. This is for stub.
Yeah.
Counterweight.
So that's your.
Yep.
That's your tube, and your bearings sitting around here somewhere.
Okay.
Little balls. What we did was we replaced this stub with a completely different form of tensioning it onto the thing, because we worked out that this type of joint is actually extremely bad for energy transfer, and it's also got a lot of vibrational issues attached to it. So what we did was we tensioned this onto the. We put a again. It was a very thin thread, but basically what we did is we tensioned this up on, so it just landed on a minimal surface here. So the rear stub actually had almost point contact with the tube and was tensioned on by a thin tensile bolt here.
Yeah.
Now, once I'd done that, what we found was that you could put the counterweight right out on the end here, and it sounded absolutely, it was swings and roundabouts. It sounded different, but it wasn't bad. It wasn't a downgrade. There was more bass. And the problem is that people kind of think that this is the solution, where you've got the counterweight close to the fulcrum, for the simple reason that the structural joint, or the character of the arm, the structural rigidity of the arm, is not that great. And if you have it out here, it creates more vibrational issues, which is caused by flexure in the arm, friction in the joints, vibration, everything. And it's not about inertia. It's about the fact that this is having to has a lot more effect on a waggly structure, and it's causing structural issues rather than inertia issues. And I think people have drawn the wrong conclusion about an observable phenomenon. I mean, I completely agree that yes, on a normal
on a Riga arm, that will sound better.
On a normal arm, it does sound better doing this. Incidentally, you have to increase the mass of your weight if you're going to get it really close to the fulcrum, which is, as we've described, is increasing the inertia in some ways, but it balances out. It's going to be lower inertia and slightly lower inertia. So anyway, that's my take on.
And this is something that we still provide for Riga Tonearms. So if you want to upgrade your Riga Tonearm, you know. And how does this? So bringing it back to arm length, how does this How does this apply to arm length?
Well, in theory, a longer arm is going to have more vertical inertia. But in practice, as we've said, for the vast majority of records, it's going to make absolutely no difference whatsoever.
Yeah.
Because this bump has to be, I mean, the cartridge has to get very excited about these bumps to kind of set off these kind of resonances and that we're talking about. Most of the time, the reaction of a low friction arm is going to take this in its stride, and it's not going to be an issue.
Yeah, because that's an interesting one, because sometimes it shows we are playing slightly warped records that might have a slight warp around that big, and the customer, you know, we have customers going, "Oh, your record's so warped," but actually the arm is tracking it almost pretty much fine. It's not ideal, and obviously we'd rather have completely flat records, but it's not quite as bad as people think.
It depends a lot on the warp on the record.
Yeah.
Most records do not have serious warps on them.
Yeah.
Even though they might be kind of going up and down, they're usually a dish, and that's the reason they kind of go up and down a bit. But the bump is very minimal. Occasionally, and I mean, I talk about once in a blue moon, I've come across a record which is seriously warped and has a very odd shaped, as I described. It's not a gentle bump. If you've got a gentle bump, it's not going to cause much issue.
Yeah.
It has to be a seriously problematic record to cause any issue.
Yeah. This kind of does bring me on to something else, another consideration, which is with extending the tube. So that is giving us a higher amount of inertia, which means the end of the tone arm isn't moving as much, which means that the cartridge is held a little bit more solidly. But having a longer tube, is that an issue for tube rigidity at all?
One of the disadvantages of a longer tube is that it will go into more resonance because it's heavier. And the heavier something is, as a rule, the more energy storage it's got. So, there is that. The only upside is that the resonant frequency will be lower, so your tonal balance will probably be, more oriented towards the bass, which some arms have problems producing.
Interesting. Okay, so it's not necessarily. Is it slightly less rigid, or not really? It just resonates differently.
It is slightly less rigid, yeah.
Right.
Depends how the arm's made, of course.
Yeah. So it seems that from all of our musings, it does seem like inertia is probably the bigger factor here than tracking error. If you were to choose between a 12-inch or a 9.5-inch, or what would you advise?
Okay. We get this question a lot from people, and it's a very good question. Should I go for a long or a short arm? There's a lot of factors involved here. The first is the 9.5-inch will fit easily on most record players, whereas 12 inches don't. So you might be tied into a 9.5 automatically.
Yeah, you have to actually have a deck that can take a 12-inch in the first place.
You might be left thinking, oh no, I wish I could fit a 12-inch arm. Should I change my deck? No, it's not like that at all. A poorly designed 12-inch arm will never get close to a well-designed 9.5-inch arm. It's only one relatively small factor in a huge and complex array of factors that go into a good tonearm design. So the next question then is it better to go for a 12-inch encounter? Because, I should say, start off, all 12-inch arms generally cost about £400 extra. With other manufacturers, it's something like 1,000, 2,000. You pay a lot of extra money for a kind of the longer arms, or should I say the non-standard length arms. And that's where it gets tricky, because sometimes it may be more effective to go up the range with a shorter arm rather than go for a longer arm.
Oh, okay.
And a model further down the range.
So invest in a tone arm that's actually a little bit more sophisticated.
Yeah.
at 9.5 inches
Yeah.
than to just go for a 12-inch. Okay, that's another really good
Yeah,
consideration. If money was no object,
right.
what would you...
Well, personally, I would gravitate to the 12-inch every time. That's my preference. I just find them much more relaxing and accessible. I wouldn't say much, but they are more relaxing and accessible to the music. They are less edgy, but they're not quite as dynamic, I'd say, or fast in some respects. So it's a close call, really.
And that's a thing, is if you, like we said at the beginning of the video, 9.5 inch sounds a bit punchier. It has a bit more attack. It can be a bit more harsh in some ways.
Yeah,
but people might prefer that with rock or pop or, you know, hard bop jazz.
Yeah, I think with thrash metal, it probably wouldn't make a lot of difference.
Yeah, well, maybe. Very musical, that thrash metal. But for things that kind of require more control, I think 12-inch is probably the way to go, whether that's classical, jazz, female vocal, a lot of music. You're right, it does sound a bit smoother with 12-inch. That's also my experience.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, there was more to say, but I think maybe we'll leave that
to another video.
Because we don't want to go on for too long. But just to say thank you to all of you guys who have been coming back to the channel, leaving your comments. We really enjoy interacting with you and hearing what you have to say. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have anything to throw at us in terms of what we've missed, or if you have any objections, please leave a comment below. We're really interested in taking on feedback. Also, please subscribe and hit the bell notification, and we will be back next week as well. So thanks very much for watching, and in the meantime, enjoy your music.